Welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Cole, and thank you for coming. There's a lot of you out there, and there's a lot of excitement, it seems, around this event as well. There should be. So I'm just going to jump right in and thank the various powers and departments and programs that be at Yale, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, Comparative Literature, the Whitney Humanities Center, the Translation Initiative, and Macmillan Center's Hira Jaffrey, our web wizard in translation at Yale once again. It's a deep and personal pleasure for me to be hosting and introducing this event. I've known Michael for a long time and watched this Ibn Arabi project develop for over 2 decades. And here we are at last able to celebrate what's really a landmark occasion, the publication of his new and magisterial edition of Ibn Arabi's Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, Translator of Desires, which is coming out or has just come out with Princeton's Lockhart Library in translation. And full disclosure, I'm a co-editor of that series with Rosanna Warren and Richard Seaberth. We're incredibly proud and pleased to have the book as part of the series. It's the first complete English translation of this key work in over 100 years, and the previous translation was into a very different English and a very different world. Michael's translation has completely renewed every aspect of this work, and its fluid and fulcral translations come together with his superb introduction and notes to take us into the heart of Ibn Arabi's visionary universe, or maybe that should be the universe of Ibn Arabi's visionary heart. Anyone who's spent any time with the history of Arabic poetry and Islamic mysticism in English translation is keenly aware of Michael's immense contribution to the field. His early studies of the pre-Islamic ode and its structures, as well as his groundbreaking translations of those odes in Desert Tracings, have opened up in really vital fashion that work to poets and readers of poetry in a global context. Other books of his that have been widely read and taught and reprinted include his Paulist Press Anthology, Early Islamic Mysticism, the Underground, and not so thanks to Jesse Helms' Underground classic, Approaching the Qur'an, a study of apophatic mysticism, the languages of unsaying, and The Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia. To all that, we can now add Michael's complete Ibn Arabi, which is really, as I say, a major event. As Omar Barada put it in an early and excellent review of the book, Sells's elegantly poignant Translator of Desires appears as the summation of a life devoted to bringing together research, pedagogy, spirituality, and poetry in ways that invite academic practice to reach beyond itself. To help us across the various bridges that Michael has built with this work, we're very fortunate to have with us today Feisal Mohamed, himself a master maker of links. Feisal is new to Yale, having just this year joined the English department, where he teaches 17th century literature and specializes in the work of Milton above all, but also Hobbes, Marvell, and others. He's received numerous awards for his work, been president of the Milton Society of America, and is the author of, among other books, In the Anteroom of Divinity, The Reformation of the Angels from Colet to Milton, Milton in the Post-Secular Present, and most recently, Sovereignty, 17th Century England, and the Making of the Modern Political Imaginary. With Gordon Huntner, he has edited A New Deal for the Humanities, Liberal Arts and the Future of Public Higher Education, and he has also written with a striking combination of leverage and grace on a broad range of topics and places such as the American Scholar, Huffington Post, the websites of the New Republic, the New York Times, and the Yale Review. I'd also urge you all to look up the short video that appeared not long ago on the Yale Today website, in which Feisal speaks in moving fashion about how important it is for undergraduates to study the past, and in particular to study pasts that take them to places of difference, different cultures, different assumptions, different ideals. While he's a Miltonist and his subject is 17th century England, he has very graciously agreed to walk that wider walk and wander into Ibn Arabi's Iberia and Middle East with Michael. Yale's lucky to have him, and so are we. And with that, Hira will make me disappear as we hand things over to Feisal and to Michael.
Thanks so much, Peter, for that very generous introduction, very delicately putting the fact that I am an unknowing novice in this conversation who is here to benefit from Michael's Socratic wisdom. The word that I think strikes me first in opening this volume is elegant. It's just a wonderfully elegant translation and edition, both in terms of the elegance of the way the Arabic is rendered into English, and also the light touch with which Michael has edited these poems, giving us everything we need to explore them in his compact and learned introductions and apparatus, and no more. Not an obtrusive editor by any stretch of the imagination. So it is really a wonderful achievement and a pleasure to be here celebrating it and also exploring it. Now, I will make a couple of brief announcements to people. There was already a question in the Q&A asking where the recording will be available, and I believe it'll be on the YouTube page of the translation initiative, though Hira may correct that in the chat. There's also a discount code for purchase of the book that will be made available in the chat for those who want to open the chat window and have a look at that if they're interested in purchasing the volume. Now, I won't say much more. I want to sort of get right into this with Michael, and perhaps before we have a first reading of a poem, Michael, you might walk us through the process leading up to the appearance of this complete translation. It is a project that has been quite some time in the making, and I'm wondering if you could take us through that somewhat.
Oh, first of all, thank you, Feisal, for agreeing to lead our conversation. And I want to also thank Peter Cole, Shaukat Turawa, Robin Cresswell, and Hira Jeffrey, and all the people involved in the various programs that made this possible. I started, my interest started in Tarjuman al-Ashwaq decades ago. I was struck by the intensity of the imagery, its play upon key elements of the Islamic love poetry tradition, the Arabic love poetry tradition in particular. That is the nasib, the remembrance of the lost beloved, that often comes at the beginning of the qasida or the larger ode. And ghazal poetry more generally, love poetry, which has a number of different moods and facets. And I found in the 61 poems of the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, a collection that Ibn Arabi states he put together in the year 614 of the Islamic era, early 13th century, that there was a wide variety of moods, registers, and sets of themes and motifs within it. And I gradually began working on translations, publishing many individual poems in various journals, and then 2 short selected collections. And as we approached this project, the style adapted for a much longer presentation. And I worked out various aspects of translation style in this project that we can talk about as we go on. And I want to thank especially the editors at the Lockhart series of poetry and translation mentioned by Peter, all three who have been so generous in providing close readings and feedback as the volume emerged.
Wonderful, thank you, Michael. Let's have a poem, shall we?
Absolutely.
So I know you'd mentioned perhaps starting with number 48.
Yes. This poem I wanted to offer as an initial taste into one of the modes and moods of the Tarjuman, the many modes and moods. You'll notice that somewhat down on the English side of the page, there are extra spaces, and that's a place where it indicates that I've translated 2 Arabic verses by one English couplet. In some cases, I've translated one Arabic verse by 2 English couplets or triplets or quartets, whichever I'm using in that particular poem. Brave. Turn at Split Rock, driver, then halt by the Moringa and Mudarish. Call out, ladies, would you grant us sweet release? Near Rama, Hajar, and White Dune, a shy-eyed girl rides in a palanquin. She lights the way like a lamp for a man walking the night. Pearl in a shell of jet black hair, the mind dives after, sinking deep. Neck supple, gestures coquette, like a gazelle of the shifting sands, like the forenoon sun arcing over Aries. When she lowers her veil, she covers dawn in her morning light. I cried out between Hima and Rama, who's here for a lad who halts and hopes at settle, for one in a desert maze, haggard, haunted, forlorn, for one drowned in his tears, drunk on the wine of her open mouth, for one burned in sighs, lost in the glow between her eyes. Desire's hand played on his heart. Where is his cry? So I turn this back to you for a discussion.
Yes. No, I mean, it's the eroticism, of course, very explicit in that poem. And you can certainly see the debts to love poetry, but it sort of raises the question that you raised in the introduction, which is to say, is Ibn Arabi a Sufi poet? Having worked on Ibn Arabi's mysticism, certainly in the Mystical Languages of Unsaying, you've worked extensively on Ibn Arabi's mystical writings. How do we see any kind of traffic between the mystical writings and the poems like this one? And can we call him a Sufi poet?
Thank you. I think this poem, like the majority of poems in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, if we didn't know that Ibn Arabi was their author, I don't think that they might have been categorized as Sufi poems. Ibn Arabi later wrote a mystical commentary on the poems. He wrote it very quickly after a critic in Aleppo criticized the poems and criticized something he said in the introduction to the poems, that these poems should be interpreted as evoking spiritual ma'arif, spiritual knowings or connaissance. And he suggested that Ibn Arabi, being a man of deen, was just a little bit embarrassed that he was writing all these erotic ghazals, and he tried to cover it up. They actually held a literary trial in Aleppo, in which Ibn Adim, the famous jurist and historian, presided over it. And Ibn Arabi had composed this mystical commentary very rapidly in a space of a couple months, and had Ibn Adim read part of it to the crowd. One thing one can say about this whole episode, which Ibn Arabi also mentions in his prefatory material to the book, is that it was hugely successful in raising the profile of Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. Everybody wants to get their book banned in Boston, so at least that used to be the case. And it brought attention to the poetry. The disadvantage was that it led to a tendency to read the poems according to the mystical commentary, and by doing so, almost skip the nature of the poems themselves. What are they like? And my own view of that is it's putting the cart before the horse. Ibn Arabi composed these poems. Years later, he was confronted with a controversy, or sometime later, not that much later. And he wrote a rapid fire commentary involving some of his allegorical and mystical thinking, with some references to mystical psychology and the states of the Sufi on the path toward union with the divine. My own sense is that the poems came first, and these poems of shauq, longing or desire, do not have in them any indication of the wider metaphysical system that Ibn Arabi referenced in his commentary. And I think they're more generative of his mystical thinking than they are simply versified mystical theology. So my goal in all of this was really to focus on the poems, which I find to be of much interest on their own.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and it goes a long way in explaining, why you elected not to include the commentary in this edition, though they're sort of bits and pieces of Ibn Arabi's sort of self-defense is included as appendices, but not the full commentary.
That's what I just was talking about was the major reason. There are some practical reasons, including the commentary would have tripled or quadrupled the length of the book, and
right.
Close to 400 pages. Nobody is inclined to open up a 1,200-page book right away. And secondly, the commentary is very difficult to bring across to a non-Arab speaking audience, because Ibn Arabi employs a constant etymological root play throughout the commentary. So I translated a sample section, which I hope to publish as an addendum somewhere to poem 11. And there I found myself having to put in parentheses all the various roots of the Arabic words that he was playing upon. Because if you don't have that, the commentary makes no sense whatsoever.
All right.
Mainly, I wanted the focus to be on the poetry as poetry.
In that spirit, let's look at another poem, perhaps.
All right. I'm going to read this one in Arabic just to give a sense of how the Arabic sounds.
Wonderful. I was hoping you would.
ليت شعري هل درى أي قلب ملكوا وفؤادي لو درى أي شعب سلكوا أتراهم سلموا أم تراهم هلكوا هار أرباب الهوى في الهوى وارتبكوا. Bewildered. I wish I knew if they knew whose heart they've taken, or my heart knew which high ridge track they follow. Do you see them safe or perishing? The lords of love are in love, ensnared, bewildered.
Now it's hearing it in Arabic and then of course in English raises several questions on selecting an English verse form, right? That might capture the spirit of the original in some way, and also the sort of the Arabic texts that we have in front of us, the sort of the labor involved in editing the Arabic texts and the sources that that were drawn on to get those together. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A is whether the poems were titled in the Arabic text, and of course that raises a whole suite of other questions on how many variants there are in terms of the Arabic manuscripts that you consulted in preparing that portion of the text.
Yes, thank you. I should first mention, for those who are not familiar with conventions of Arabic poetry, that this starts out with a question about they, and the background of that would be they are the ensemble of the beloved and her retinue, who are riding away from the poet after the separation between the beloved and the poet. But the they, I should mention, often can be a metonymy for the beloved herself, referring to the singular by the plural. And it gives all kinds of subtleties, as Ibn Arabi weaves throughout the Tarjuman, this movement between a beloved is a singular and the beloveds as the ensemble. As far as translation is concerned, clearly Arabic with an end rhyme after every verse would make for awkward translation into rhymes. The English language just does not do that naturally. And the very strict meters, there are about 12 major meters that Ibn Arabi employs, the major meters of the classical period. It would be very awkward to try to imitate them in English. So how do we compensate for the loss of these two essential features, end rhyme and a meter? So I try to compensate by finding a rhythm and a cadence that brings across the same kind of play between tension and release that you find in metrical poetry, when there's a tension, when the metrical foot falls in the middle of a syntactical point or a word, and then there's a release when the metrical point and the words and the syntax flow together. So that kind of dance of language was very important. I also wanted to preserve the play between verses of the Arabic. So each Arabic verse has a very strong acoustic closure with the end rhyme. Yet the meaning is in constant movement across the boundaries of the verses. And between the verses, there's often a play of possibilities. Who is the he or she referring to in the previous verse? If it's unspecified, etc. And to preserve that play, I ended up deciding not to use end stops or periods after the verses, or even in the translation at all, on the grounds that the end stop seems to suggest a semantic stop as well as an acoustical stop. And I wanted to have that indeterminacy play over across the verses. So we'll note that throughout the samples that we read today. I'm aware that some readers not familiar with this relatively unusual punctuation style may find it takes a while to get used to. But I also found that after repeated efforts to make the poems come alive, this was the way I found that I could keep their vitality.
And the Arabic texts, in terms of editing the Arabic text portion of the book, how consistent are the manuscripts that we have of the poems?
I used about 8 major manuscripts. One of the most historical manuscripts, which is in very good shape and very accurate, I used as a default. And there's not that much difference among them within the manuscripts, maybe a word here or there, etc. What there is difference is in the order of the poems, especially toward the end. I found almost every manuscript had a different order of the last 10 or 15 poems. I chose to maintain the order in the Nicholson translation and edition of 1911, because those who know of this work at all know of it through the Nicholson edition. Excuse me, I just got an annoying notice. Okay, yeah, so, but we're lucky to have many manuscripts of the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. I did find 2 significant places. One, in one of Ibn Arabi's most famous poems, poem 11, the poem that has the statement, I profess the religion of love, adinu bidin al-hubbi. That poem has 2 verses in almost all of the translations that don't exist in the manuscripts. They exist in the manuscripts for the commentary, but not in the manuscripts of the poems themselves. And I think in that case, it may well be that while the commentary was being composed, Ibn Arabi put in a couple explanatory verses, more like a commentary within the poem.
And the sort of quick answer to the question someone has asked: were the poems titled in the Arabic text?
No, like almost all of classical Arabic poems, there's no title, so they were referred to by their first verse or their end rhyme, and I put the titles in to kind of give the English reader a sense of something that was important that would tie the poem together.
Great, thank you, Michael. Maybe we'll let's go back to the poems, shall we?
Absolutely. I only want to read the first 2 verses of this poem, also to talk a little bit about translation. This is a long poem in which the figure of Nizam, who was the inspiration, a young woman who was the inspiration for the whole Tarjuman, appears embedded within the poetry. We don't have time to read the whole poem, but I wanted just to mention some more translation choices. So I'll read the first two verses in Arabic and then in English. And you'll see I've translated the first verse by two English quatrains and then all the other verses by one. Maradi min maridatil ajfani, allilani bidhikriha, allilani. حفت الورق بالرياض وناحت شجر هذا الحمام مما شجاني. I'm in a bad way, lost in the languor of her eyes. Say her name and heal me, recalling hers, my only cure. Doves rustled in the green, cooing, sad with the same sadness that's mine. So here, I chose extra words to translate the first verse because to translate literally or word by word with all this reference to sickness and mard, it really calls up connotations in modern English that I think are heavier than they are in the Arabic. And the word al-lilani, which is repeated, which can mean cure me, but also give me a second draught of wine. I thought that there needed to be a way of bringing in that kind of repetition in the first two verses. So that's why it took two English stanzas to translate the first verse.
Yeah, and you've opted for the sort of shorter English lines on the page. Yes. There as well, with the sort of the short lines for each. Is it 4 lines for each line of Arabic all the way through?
Right.
Perhaps walk us through that choice.
Yes, working over draft after draft of these poems, I tried them out with couplets corresponding to the Arabic verse, triplets, and quatrains. My goal was to bring across the tone, the mood, and the voice of the poem in the most effective way possible. And for some poems, I ended up using a longer verse form, maybe fewer verses per stanza. And in a poem like this, I found that the shorter verse form, bringing across more interior rhythmic tension for each part of the poem, poetic verse, seemed to work best. So it was basically a project of experimentation.
Yeah, but certainly, I mean, I think the shorter emotionally charged lines, I think work very well in the English to convey that the sort of intense emotionality of the poem on the page. Let's go to the next one, shall we?
Sure.
I think number 7 is the one I've got on my list.
Right. Gowns of dark. I touched the stone through a whirl of young women circling the Kaaba, faces veiled. They lowered their veils, revealing the sun. Death stalks the gaze they warned. Many's the proud soul we've taken questing at the threshold of Minna's cairns in the Wadi courts near the heights of Ram and Jem, through the throngs on Arafah plain. See how beauty plunders the chase, spoiler of virtue so aptly named. And the next page. We'll meet at Zamzam after the circling by the middle tent, near the boulders. There a man starved by love's fever is cured by the scent of those who lured him. Roused, they loosen their hair and let it fall, enfolding themselves in dark. And back to you.
Yeah, it's now when I first read this poem, I thought, you know, that the gowns of dark, you know, in the way of the pilgrim at the Kaaba, it sort of sounded like temptation, being lured away. But you know, in our previous conversation, you sort of alerted me to the fact that no, the relationship between love poetry and the hedge is much more complex than that.
Well, I certainly think your reading is 100% correct, that the poem is provocative in that way. Raising these beautiful women figures, reminiscent of Houris, the black-eyed maidens in the Quran, sometimes viewed as kind of graces, accepting figures, and sometimes, as clearly articulated in the poem, occasions of temptation, spoilers of virtue, as it's aptly named. So that's definitely there. And there's a whole tradition of erotic poems connected with the Hajj that I think was particularly grounded for Ibn Arabi in traditions that go back to earlier poets, Sharif al-Radi and Mihyar al-Daylami. These were two major Shiite figures who led Hajj caravans from Baghdad to Mecca and composed many of their nasibs, or some of their nasibs, with Hajj themes. Ibn Arabi seems to have come into contact with these two poems through the intermediary of the Hanbalite jurist, Sufi, and author of one text criticizing certain Sufi tendencies, Ibn al-Jawzi, who wrote a book called Muthir al-Gharam Sakin ila Aqdas el-Amak, stirring passion for the most holy sites. And in it, he takes every aspect of the pilgrimage. It's a book on Hajj, and cites numerous poems, mainly by Mihyar al-Daylami and Sharif al-Radi, connecting the eroticism of those poems to the stations on the Hajj, with the goal, as mentioned in his title, of stirring passion for the would-be pilgrim, especially during the harsh conditions of the journey to Mecca and back. And Ibn Arabi read this book. He refers to it in his own belletristic works. And so there was this entire tradition of weaving the Hajj into erotic lyric by this time. Ibn Arabi's poems have a different flavor and tone than those of the previous two poets. And there's so much work that can be done in this area. I noticed also that when Ibn Arabi talks about the religion of love, which becomes the most quoted line in his poetry, without understanding how the Hajj and the Hadith and Islamic mystical theology, haram and halal, all these aspects are incorporated into the poems. So when he talks about the religion of love, the religion is thickly grounded in the actual a ritual and theological heart of Islam at that time.
It does, it brings to mind very directly the next poem we might have a look at, with the Hadith of Love, to see how the Hadith also get incorporated into this poetry.
All right. Poem 14.
That's right.
Eric, could we have poem 14? Hadith of Love. Lightning flashed and yearned for the east. Had it flashed from the west, there he'd have turned. I burn for the lightning, the flash, not for this or some other piece of ground. The east wind brought us the word from distraction, from rapture and sorrow, from my disarray, from drunkenness, reason, longing and grief, from the fire, from my heart. The one you seek is within your ribs, turned in each breath from side to side. Tell him, I told them, he's the one who lit the fire within my heart. To be with you now alone would quench it. If it rages, why blame my love? So let's go back to, yeah, hello.
Yeah, what's really striking in that poem is that you know, turn within, in the heart, within the ribs. And there you see that sort of double dynamic of desire, that it is felt within, though it attaches itself to an external object.
Right.
And it is, in this poem, reminiscent of mystical flight, right? Which is also a turn within to that flame of the soul, which then leads one towards its proper union to God. So that sort of inner outer dynamic, I think, you know, knowing Ibn Arabi as a mystical writer perhaps sort of leads us in that direction, but it is a dynamic that at least can be drawn into parallel, and also might explain too why mystical writings are so often so erotically charged, because these two experiences can be brought into this kind of parallel.
Right. A couple points in that regard. The reference to the one you seek is within your ribs, rolled back and forth in each moment, is an allusion to a Quranic verse and also to a hadith. This is, I should also mention that this poem is structured like a hadith. So the long chain of interior states, longing and grief and the fire and the heart, are all chains in the isnad, bringing down the original word from the beloved through this isnad, and then the matan, or the message within the hadith, is that verse that I put in italics. Unusually, of course, this doesn't happen in standard hadith. The poem sends the message back up the isnad to the beloved, saying, tell him he's the one who lit the fire within my heart. So presumably that message goes back up all the way to the isnad. Ibn Arabi was a muhaddith, a hadith collector. And his whole experience when he arrived in Mecca the year 1201 to 1202, he fell in with a group of hadith scholars, a woman and her brother from Isfahan, who were the father and aunt of a young lady named Nizam, who became the inspiration for the Tarjuman, compared by some to Beatrice with Dante. In his belletristic work, Muhadarat al-Abrar, which hasn't been translated or critically edited or much discussed at all, he talks about sessions, majalis or muhadarat, with various hadith scholars, in which he and they would trade hadith traditions and recite erotic poetry in the same session. Certainly there's enough detail, and we can trace some of the places and times to his biography, that we can imagine these sessions were historical. But of course, they're presented through an imaginary within this larger vision of the religion of love, in which hadith, like the Hajj and like other aspects of Islam, are incorporated into the poetry, into love poetry as central aspects.
There is a question in the Q&A that asks, how you deal with Quranic echoes, and in this case also Hadith echoes. The device of italics you've drawn our attention to in this poem, but more generally how you deal with Quranic echoes in the translation. The person asking the question here asks, do you use italics, footnotes? Do you find yourself using Quran translation for those words?
Great question.
How have you dealt with Quranic echoes? Yeah.
When it's more or less direct quote, or presented as a kind of hadith on its own, which is not from the classical hadith, but a lover's hadith, I often will italicize it to let it stand out in that way. In the notes to the poems, I've written a kind of mini essay on each poem at the back. And in those notes to the poems, I bring out the key Quranic references, which are everywhere in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, as well as key hadith references, and weave them into the commentary on the poem itself.
Okay, great, thank you, Michael. That was I should give credit for the question where it's due. That was Omar Ali Deonzaga from the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, who asked that one. Let's move on to the next poem then.
Ridwa. Happy the thought of Ridwa's pastures, where the traveler finds cool waters and rest. My love's party might have heard of the place, kneeled camels there and encamped. Wherever they go, my soul clings as they chant their camels on. And when amid shouts they break toward desert, you can hear it howling on their trail. If they move towards Zawra, that's where it leads them. If it's Jawra they seek, it awaits them there. Next page. Kira, could we have the next page? Thank you. Wherever they are, wherever they camp, the bird follows, for its chicks are there. Two fears ceaselessly vie within me, fear for myself and fear for her, lest her splendor shatter my gaze, and she be deafened by my sighs.
I mean, that one, there is a really sort of compressed economy of, journey, spiritual flight, desire, really sort of all tightly woven together in that one. I don't know how much more to add to it than that, but other than you really sort of see a sort of wonderful compression there of those elements that run through so many of these poems, all tied together.
Thank you. I think one of the points of compression in this poem and intensified emotion has to do with what I would call the lover's schizophrenia, or the poet's schizophrenia. Going back to pre-Islamic poetry, when the poet recalls the beloved getting into her palanquin or hautage, moving off with the other women of the tribe, surrounded by guides, camel guides and camel chanters, going off to the distance. And then the poet depicts the various places that the beloved is, often listing numerous what we call stations of the beloved. But of course, the poet is not there. So the poet is actually somehow implicitly, part of the poet is following with the beloved. In Ibn Arabi's poetry, he draws out the psychological tension there very explicitly by saying, wherever they go, my heart clings. And when they break toward desert, you can hear it howling on their trail. And then he presents himself as actually leading them in their journey away from him. And I think that that kind of poetic schizophrenia occurs in several of the poems and intensifies them in that way that you were speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, the psychological has a reality there. He is with them.
Right.
It's not presented as a mere figure in the poem.
Absolutely not.
In a way that's quite striking. We're sort of, I think we're sort of winding down in time. So perhaps, we really can't leave it off today without poem 11. I think that may be worth a look.
Let's take a look at poem 11. Eric, did we go to poem 11? Oh, you're already ahead of me. I only want to read the first part of this poem, which is a poem that has the last few verses about the religion of love are among the most widely quoted verses of Arabic poetry. But I think that, again, taking those verses out of context, you lose a lot of the dynamic within the poem. And key to the poet getting to the point where he declares the religion of love, he goes through a transformation. And here's a poem where a Sufi theme is fairly explicit. So I'll just read the translation here and a focus on verse 4. Gentle now, doves. Gentle now, doves of the Sprigbury and Moringa, don't add sighs to my heartache. Gentle now, lest your sad cooing show the love I hide, the sorrow I seal. In the evening I echo back, in the morning echo the longing of the lovesick and lost. Spirits moan in the Ghada trees, bending branches over me as I pass away, bringing yearning, heartbreak, and ever new twists of pain to try me. So this verse 4, let's keep the screen up for just a moment. I'll read the verse 4 in Arabic. تناوحت الأرواح في غيدة الغداء فمالت بأفنان علي Afnani. So the final, there's a play on the word Afnani in this verse and in the following verse. In the last word of this verse, it means cause me to pass away, or cause me, or annihilate me. And it's clearly suggestive of the Sufi doctrine or Sufi notion of fana, where the ego self of the seeker passes away in union with the divine beloved. That often is represented by a famous hadith tradition in which God declares of the believer who approaches him through required and especially through voluntary devotions, that at that point, that is the divine speaker, I become the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, the hands with which he touches, the feet with which he walks, and in one variant, the tongue with which he speaks. So here we have an example where a Sufi theme is incorporated right at this moment. And there's another theme in several of these other poems where you have winds or spirits rustling in the trees, and the poet having those branches pulled down upon him or rustled over him, going through a transformative experience, an experience of death, and death often occurs within these poems at a key moment of transformation within the poem itself. Oh, we can take off the screen now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's you describe that poem in your notes as the keystone of the Tarjuman, and in some ways you've explained already why that is, and it's also among one of the first you translated, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yes, without reading the whole poem, just to say that after this transformative experience beneath these Ghada trees, the poet arrives at a place where there's a transformation in the poet's identity. So in many of these poems, the poet lover is circling the Kaaba or journeying on the way to the Kaaba. At some point in this poem, Ibn Arabi, the poet, declares that these beautiful women figures, these graces, circle his heart and touch each corner with a kiss. So at that point, the lover has become the Kaaba, and the motion is reversed. Instead of following the beloveds after the beloveds or journeying toward the Kaaba, at this point, the lover becomes the still center of movement, and these figures move around the Kaaba, circumambulate the Kaaba of the human heart.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Michael. Now, just before turning to some of the questions people have submitted, I'm going to steal the first question for myself and ask, which are the English poets that perhaps were most on your mind here? I mean, this is not just an achievement of translation, but also wonderfully elegant poems. And I'm wondering which are the English poets that you were drawing on for inspiration?
I think two poets were especially helpful. One, Kenneth Rexroth, who was a master of amatory and erotic poetry. I'm not referring so much to his translations of Japanese and Chinese poems, although they're magnificent, but to his own poems specifically. There's a book called Flower Wreath Hill that has a number of these poems that have that deep mood of longing, sometimes of grief, a very nice measured verse. And then Adrian Rich, whose first volumes, Diving into the Wreck and Dream of a Common Language, and A Wild Patience Has Carried Me Thus Far, also have this really strong sense of American love lyric built within them. Also at a time when love lyric has become less prominent in American poetry in general, it's often made up for in a popular song. So if one takes Bob Dylan's album Time Out of Mind and compares it to the tone and mood of these poems, I suggest people listen to Not Dark Yet. It's the kind of thing that's so striking when read in connection with the Tarjuman. The same kind of elegiac mood, the same sense of longing is there. And of course, the poems of Leonard Cohen, which also create a religion of love, mixing religion and intense love lyric throughout. I should also mention about Adrian Rich that she had a great interest in the ghazal form, and she contributed to a volume of American poets who translated, with the help of Urdu-speaking intermediary, the ghazals of the great poet Ghalib. And among those translations, I think those by Adrian Rich are, for my, in my taste, were the most powerful.
Yeah, fascinating. Some surprising names there. The Dylan and Cohen. Perhaps the most surprising of that bunch. To turn to some of the questions people have submitted now. One from Sarah Alderwood asking, did you encounter any difficult emotional lexicons while translating, and how did you compensate for that?
Yes, I mean, that's a core part of the endeavor is working with these emotional registers, which in the Tarjuman can go from ironic to frenetic, to solemn, to grieving, to celebrating, to flirtatiousness, and finding an English language of today that would bring that across. So the example that we had earlier, translating Maradi min Marida to Lajfani as I'm in a bad way, lost in the languor of her eyes. I felt that there I was trying to get at that emotional core of that verse without using words that in contemporary English, like sickness, conjure up issues of hospital and medical care, et cetera, that really would be distracting.
Yeah.
Often I would also try to listen to the sound of the English verses as they emerge and use assonance and sometimes rhyme when the rhyme appeared naturally. So burned in size, lost in the glow within her eyes. That came out at a critical point in the poem and seemed to work in a way where certain rhymes, if they emerge naturally out of the sound and cadence of the poem at certain times, can help capture that emotion.
Great, thank you, Michael. And next question from Francis Pritchett. Is there ever any ambiguity about the gender of the beloved? Can it be a beautiful male youth or potentially God, or is that a later ghazal development?
Yes, the Tarjuman, generally the convention in the Tarjuman is the beloved is female, going back to pre-Islamic poetry. But there are several poems where the beloved is clearly male. And there are some poems where imagery associated with the male beloved appears, and then in a way that I translated, the beloved as he, and then later on it's clearly she. So you can have a switch from male beloved to female beloved figure within a single poem. Often the male beloved appears in ghazal poems, poems that in many cases are indebted to Andalusian ghazal masters, and also to muwashahat, the stanzaic poems, especially in Andalus, where often the beloved appears as male, is really depicted in a strong way as a male beloved.
Yeah, I mean, hearing your response raises a question that has been on my mind, which is, just how we see these poems as a product of al-Andalus and of Andalusian culture. I mean, what are the various influences of that place of this period that are represented here?
Yes, I think one can, it's very clear that a couple of these poems used as models earlier Andalusian muwashahat, particularly by the poet known as the blind man of Tudela. Ibn Arabi was clearly steeped in that tradition, probably from the time that he studied there as a young man. And there's definitely that sense. It is more playful ghazal poems of that tradition being carried on. He doesn't compose these poems as muwashahat. He composed muwashahat elsewhere. But some of the poems that were his model muwashahat, he composed in the poetic meter popular poetic meter of Rajis, which gives us another kind of similar sense of a kind of tripping language, tripping along. So those are some thoughts on that. But as I mentioned, many of his poems are also deeply indebted to pre-Islamic nasibs, and the poems involving the Hajj, particularly to the kind of poetry that was pioneered by Sharif Aradi and Mihyar Daly.
I'll turn back to the questions here. One from Emil Al-Khalek. My old friend, good to see you.
Hello, Emil. Long time no see.
And he's wondering what the sponsor areas of greatest distance were between Ibn Arabi and your English.
Well, clearly the basic classical Arabic structure of end rhyme and these intricate complex meters was a major one. And then the other aspects, when to keep an Arabic metaphor and when not to keep it. For example, there are numerous words in the Tarjuman that could be translated as heart. So one of them that I kept as in the form of the Arabic was as in that line, the one you love is within your ribs, turned in each breath from side to side. Because although it could be translated as within your heart, the breath is also crucial there. And within the ribs encompasses both the heart and lungs. So I felt there it was really necessary to preserve that. Another aspect is that sometimes what we would normally view as the heart appears in Arabic poetry as the liver. And of course, that has all kinds of associations in English, which are not there in the Arabic, alcoholism, etc. So I had to be judicious, tried to be judicious there. But at some point, Ibn Arabi talks about the beloved living in the dark core of the liver. And the dark core there conjures up the notion of melancholia. Of course, all the Arabs of this period were influenced by Greek medicine and the doctrine of the humors. So in some cases, I kept to that language. If I could find a judicious way of placing it in the poem, keeping it in the poem without too much distraction, because it seemed very essential. And it also goes to a dynamic between a light and dark that goes throughout the poems. The darkness being the place of secrecy, of the deepest emotion, of quiet, of relief from the glare of the sun, etc.
Now, I note that there's someone in attendance who has a hand raised. If I could get that person to type the question in the Q&A so we can see it, that would be helpful. And in the meantime, we'll go to another question from Hanan El Sayed, saying she's used Maurice Gauton's excellent French translation of Tarjuman when writing on it in French, and hoping that there would be a recent English translation. Have you looked at the Gauton translation? And what are your thoughts?
Yes, indeed. I benefited and immersed myself in all the major translations in Spanish, French, and German, where there's been a generous activity of Ibn Arabi translation. Maurice Gauton was the first to translate almost the entirety of the mystical commentary, as well as all the poems. And I find some of his translations in French to be quite elegant. I met him one time, and I asked him how he learned Arabic. And he said, I knew no Arabic, but when I read Ibn Arabi's poems in translation, I decided I had to learn Arabic so I could immerse myself into them. And he composed this marvelous contribution. More recently, there have been major translations in German, and two really groundbreaking translations in Spanish. So in the appendix to the book, I have an appreciative chronological brief description of the translation history of the Tarjuman.
Okay, I think, let's see. I'm going to try to allow someone to talk, I think, to accommodate one more question, since it hasn't yet come up in the Q&A. Suzanne, are you able to talk? If you'd unmute yourself.
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful, go ahead.
I mostly just want to say to greet Michael. Yaroslav and I are here. We've enjoyed this very much. I would like to maybe just go to the title and wonder what you would say about what does Tarjuman mean? What are the metaphorical dimensions of Tarjuman, especially as a title for a collection of poetry?
Thank you, Suzanne and Yaroslav. I should mention that these are my teachers and colleagues going back decades. I've learned immeasurably from both of them. And Yaroslav wrote the classic book on the Arabic Nasib called Zephyrs of Nejd, and I wanted to highly recommend that book to anybody that's interested in following up on the Nasib form of Arabic love poetry. As far as the Tarjuman is concerned, I found in Ibn Arabi's belletristic work, Muhadarat al-Abrar, he has numerous poems, love poems that of his own that aren't in the Tarjuman. And he, at one point, he talks about a poem inspired by Nizam. He says, bin Nizamiyat. And he says, among the poems composed by the Ashwaq in the mode of Nizamiyat is the following. So there he makes clear that in this case, at least, the author of the poem are the Ashwaq, the longings or desires. And then he gives his version in Arabic. So in some sense, I think you could say that the volume presents itself as taking the language of shauq, of longing or desire, and putting it into an articulate, poetic Arabic. Not that the Ashwaq don't speak Arabic. Far from it from that. But that's some initial thought on it.
Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful to see you in this wonderful new collection of translations. Congratulations from both of us.
All my best.
On that note, and with my profuse apologies to those who had questions that we didn't get to, but we are unfortunately out of time. So if everyone would join me, though the webinar format doesn't entirely allow it, in thanking Michael for sharing this wonderful new translation with us, which will promises to be the standard text of Ibn Arabi's poems for many, many years to come. Thanks so much, Michael. It was an absolute pleasure.
It was a great pleasure, and thank you, Faisal.
Good evening, everyone.
Ciao.